The auction hall smelled of dust and iron, like old coins pressed into damp earth. Wooden bleachers creaked under the weight of bodies leaning forward, eyes sharp with hunger not for animals but for bargains. On the stage, under a harsh strip of yellow light, stood the dog. His left hind leg trembled, barely bearing his weight. Scars ribboned across his flank, and his coat, once black and gold, now clung dull and uneven like a burned field. The crowd whispered and shifted, but when the auctioneer barked the first price, silence answered. Nobody moved. The man with the gavel chuckled nervously, lowering the numbers with each breath, as if peeling dignity away from the animal in front of everyone. The dog's ears pinned back, his chest rising too fast, the whites of his eyes showing like moons. Minutes stretched like hours, and still no hand rose. He stood abandoned on the block, broken before strangers, until a figure at the far corner, a man in a worn coat, face shadowed, silent as stone, lifted his hand. No one knew his name, no one expected his bid, but the dog, trembling, turned his eyes toward him. The air inside the auction barn carried a thickness that wasn't just dust. It was the weight of old hay, sweat, and a kind of quiet cruelty that settles where money decides fate. Wooden rafters arched above like tired ribs, every beam stained with years of storms and spilled coffee. The lights were bare bulbs strung unevenly, buzzing faintly as if they resented their duty. In the middle of the ring, under their harsh glow, stood the German shepherd. He was not the kind of dog people wanted. Not tonight, not in this place. His hind leg shook like a fence post in the wind, a visible tremor that told more of pain than weakness. His coat had lost its luster, patches of dull fur clung to him in uneven strokes, leaving the map of his suffering exposed. Scars puckered his flank, faint silver threads crisscrossing like broken stitching. But it was his eyes that carried the heaviest weight. They were wide, alert, rimmed in white. The eyes of something cornered, something that had already learned too much about betrayal. The auctioneer tapped his gavel against the block, the hollow crack echoing like a pistol shot through the hall. His voice followed, sharp and rehearsed, words that belonged more to cattle or machinery than to a living thing. German shepherd, male, injured. Startin' at 200. Who'll give me 2? He scanned the crowd, lips curled in a salesman's smile. Silence. He lowered his price. 150. Strong breed, just needs a little work. Who'll start me off? Again no hands lifted. The only sound was the restless shuffle of boots against sawdust, a cough muffled into a sleeve, the creak of the bleachers as people leaned back, waiting for the next lot. The shepherd's ears flattened. He did not bark, did not growl. He only stood, chest heaving too fast, eyes darting at the crowd, at the hands that would not move. To them he was less than nothing, a burden, a cost. The auctioneer cleared his throat and dropped the number again. 100, 80, 50. His smile faltered. The murmurs in the crowd were low, dismissive, almost embarrassed by the sight of him. For a moment, the shepherd shifted his weight and the bad leg buckled. He went down onto one knee, catching himself with a desperate claw against the floorboards. A ripple of laughter rolled from the far side of the room, not cruel in volume, but cruel in its indifference. A man spat tobacco into a tin cup. A woman whispered something into her husband's ear, and they both shook their heads. The auctioneer sighed, wiping his brow with a handkerchief, ready to wave the lot off as unsold. And then, from the shadowed corner of the hall, a hand lifted. It was not eager, not sharp like the quick bids of men who smelled profit. It rose slow, deliberate, like a branch weighed by ice. For a breath, nobody noticed. The auctioneer hesitated mid-sentence, scanning until his eyes found it. A figure sat alone, shoulders hunched under a dark coat that had known too many winters. His face was half hidden in shadow, but his stillness was unmistakable. The shepherd saw him. Perhaps it was instinct, or perhaps it was the silent gravity of one wounded soul recognizing another. His ears twitched, his panting slowed, and for the first time that night, his gaze held steady. The man did not smile, did not speak. He only raised his hand higher, sealing the bid without words. Sold. The auctioneer barked quickly, almost with relief. His gavel came down hard, rattling the thin wood of the block. The crowd murmured, surprise, confusion, even disapproval. Why waste money on a dog that would cost more in medicine than it could ever repay? Some shook their heads, others chuckled low. But the man in the coat did not move to answer their questions. He lowered his hand, folded it back into his lap, and waited. The shepherd's body trembled as the handler looped a frayed rope around his neck. He resisted the tug, planting paws against the floor, but his eyes never left the corner. Not the door, not the crowd, not even the handler's boots. Only the figure who had chosen him when no one else would. The rope tightened, forcing him forward, and each limp step echoed through the barn like an unsteady heartbeat. When they reached the man, he stood. Taller than expected, broad in the shoulders, his movements unhurried. He reached into his coat and pulled out folded bills, placing them into the handler's palm without bargaining, without words. The handler shrugged, pocketed the money, and walked away, leaving rope and dog alike in the stranger's possession. For a moment the man simply stood there, the shepherd at his side. Neither moved. The dog's chest rose and fell in quick, shallow gasps. The man's breathing was slower, heavier, but both rhythms filled the space between them. Around them, the auction went on, another lot being dragged onto the block, another bid starting high and falling lower. But in that small circle of sawdust and silence, the world felt narrowed to two figures, one broken, one unreadable, bound together by the simple act of a raised hand. The man shifted his coat, knelt slightly, and rested his hand on the rope, not pulling, only holding it loosely. His other hand, rough and scarred, hovered near the shepherd's muzzle. The dog stiffened, lips twitching back from teeth. But the man did not withdraw. He waited, hand steady, eyes level. A long second stretched, then another, until finally the shepherd's trembling eased. He did not lick the hand. He did not lean into it. But he did not bite. And in that fragile absence of violence, something began. The man stood, adjusted his coat, and turned toward the exit. The shepherd, limping, followed. Each step was hesitant, but he did not pull away. The crowd parted without words, watching them go. Some smirked, others muttered, but no one stopped them. The doors groaned open, letting in the cold night air, and the light from the bulbs fell away behind them. The man's hand held the rope loosely, and the shepherd's eyes, still wide but no longer frantic, kept their focus on his back. Outside, the wind carried the scent of frost and pine. The auction's noise dulled behind wooden walls, replaced by the distant howl of a coyote. The man opened the door of an old truck, the paint long faded, and lifted the dog gently onto the bench seat. The shepherd resisted at first, but then sagged against the cracked leather, exhaustion winning over fear. The man slid in beside him, turned the key, and the engine coughed alive. He did not speak a word, not even to himself. The road stretched into darkness, headlights carving two pale rivers across the dirt. In the cab's silence, the shepherd's breathing steadied. He shifted once, laying his head against the seat, and his eyes closed halfway, still watchful but no longer desperate. The man kept his gaze forward, one hand on the wheel, the other resting loosely near the dog. Their shadows moved together across the windshield, two broken silhouettes heading into the unknown, bound not by choice, but by a raised hand in a room that had already turned away. The truck rattled down the unpaved road like an old bone jar shaken by unseen hands. Every bump in the dirt made the German shepherd flinch, his claws scraping against the worn vinyl seat. The smell inside the cab was a mix of oil, tobacco, and old leather, the kind of scent that belonged to years of solitude. The man kept one hand steady on the wheel, his face unreadable in the glow of the dashboard. He didn't look at the dog. He didn't speak. The silence between them was not hostile, but it was heavy, the kind of silence that could either suffocate or heal. Outside, the night was starless, the kind of deep black that swallows distance. Fence posts flickered by in the headlights like tired sentinels, leaning in the earth. In the back, a metal crate shifted with every rut in the road, and when they stopped at a crossing, the man leaned over, lifted the trembling shepherd, and set him gently inside. The dog resisted, teeth flashing once, but the stranger's grip was firm without cruelty, placing him in the crate as though it were not a cage but a shelter. He pulled his coat from his shoulders, a faded canvas thing patched at the elbows, and draped it over the top. The light dimmed, the roar of headlights softened, and for the first time that night, the dog stopped panting. The drive stretched on, measured not in miles but in the sound of tires crushing gravel, in the rhythm of a man's slow breathing and a dog's cautious stillness. Now and then the shepherd shifted, testing the crate bars with a tentative paw. But when no force came back, only stillness, he settled again. The stranger's hand occasionally brushed the coat covering the crate, adjusting it, securing it when the wind threatened to peel it back. Each small gesture was unspoken language, the beginning of a dialogue neither had agreed to but both seemed to understand. When at last the truck turned up a narrow track, the sound of the world changed. Gravel gave way to softer dirt, and the lights caught the outline of a cabin hunched against the dark, its chimney coughing a thread of smoke into the wind. The man parked, cut the engine, and the silence that followed was startling. The shepherd's ears twitched at the sudden absence of noise, and in the stillness, even the whisper of pine needles seemed loud. The man stepped out, boots crunching, then returned to lift the crate. He carried it not like a burden, but like something fragile, and set it down on the porch boards that groaned beneath their combined weight. The door to the cabin resisted his hand at first, swollen with age, then gave way. The air inside smelled of wood smoke and iron pans, of books left open too long. Shadows stretched across walls papered in faded photographs, frames crooked, glass clouded with dust. He placed the crate in the corner by the fireplace where the heat from the embers still breathed warmth into the room. Kneeling, he pulled the coat away, folding it neatly instead of tossing it aside. The dog's eyes flicked wild, tracking every motion. His ears were back, body pressed low against the crate floor. But when the man set down a metal bowl filled with water, not pushed too close, just near enough, the shepherd's nostrils flared. He didn't drink. Not yet. The man moved with a rhythm born of habit. He lit a lamp on the table, its flame trembling into life, painting the cabin in soft amber. He pulled a loaf of bread from a tin box, tore off a piece, and ate silently, chewing as if he didn't notice the creature watching him. After a moment, he tore another piece, smaller, and set it on the floor near the water bowl. Again, not inside the crate but in reach. Then he sat back in a chair, eyes low, not staring. Silence once again did the talking. The shepherd's body quivered with hunger and suspicion. His lips curled back in a soft growl when the man leaned to toss another piece of bread closer. But the man didn't flinch, didn't withdraw. He simply sat back again, as though he had all the hours in the world to wait. And slowly, painfully, the dog inched forward. His paws scraped softly against the crate floor, claws clicking once. His nose touched the bread. He sniffed, hesitated, then pulled it back inside, devouring it in one sharp gulp before retreating again to the safety of shadows. The man said nothing, only nodded once, as though a contract had been signed. Hours passed this way. The cabin's clock ticked unevenly, the fire sank low, and the night outside pressed hard against the windows. The man dozed in his chair, chin tilted toward his chest, hands rough and scarred resting on his knees. The shepherd watched, ears tilting to catch every shift of his breathing, eyes darting to the door as though measuring escape. But no escape was offered, no threat either. Only the sound of one man asleep in a chair, and the steady warmth of fire. Near dawn, when the first thin blade of light found its way through the curtain, the shepherd shifted again. He stretched his neck through the crate's opening, sniffed the coat folded on the floor. The smell was sweat, smoke, something human but not hostile. Carefully, he rested his chin on it. He closed his eyes. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, he slept without trembling. When the man stirred awake, he noticed. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened, and he pulled another log onto the fire. The crackle filled the silence. The dog flinched at the noise, then resettled, his head still pressed against the stranger's coat. And the man, standing tall once again, poured water into the kettle, humming low under his breath, as if the cabin, for the first time in years, was not emptied. Snow came without ceremony, drifting down in silence until the earth itself seemed to exhale beneath its weight. By the time the man returned from chopping wood, the cabin roof wore a thin white crown, and the windows glowed soft against the dark. Inside, the German shepherd lay in his crate, eyes following every movement, ears twitching at every hinge creak. His legs still trembled when he shifted, though the swelling had eased. The wound, a raw scar hidden in the fur, needed tending. The man knew it, and the dog knew it too. That evening he carried a battered tin box from a shelf and set it on the table. Inside were rolls of gauze, a bottle of iodine, scissors dulled from years of use. He didn't look at the dog when he opened it. Instead, he poured water into a small basin, the steam curling upward, carrying the smell of iron and soap. His hands moved without hurry, though they bore the hesitation of someone who had not tended to another living thing in a long time. The shepherd rose slightly, chest tense, growl rumbling low but uncertain. The man didn't command him. He didn't call him nearer. He only sat on the floor, basin by his knee, and unwrapped the first strip of gauze. His own hands bore their own map of injury, a thumb that bent wrong, skin pulled taut where fire had once kissed it too long, a faint tremor that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with memory. He stretched out one palm, not to restrain but to offer. The shepherd's eyes locked on it, white rims showing again. A pause, a deep swallow of air. Then, slowly, he lowered his muzzle close enough to smell the salt, the smoke, the truth of another scarred body. When the man reached toward the leg, teeth flashed. The growl sharpened, a knife in the silence. The man did not recoil. He let the dog's jaw graze the air near his wrist, close enough to feel the heat of breath, then lowered his hand again. He waited, patient as snow. Minutes passed, the firewood popped, the kettle hissed. Then, with a grunt as though surrendering to exhaustion, the shepherd allowed the touch. The cloth pressed gently against the wound. The dog flinched hard, but the man murmured something. Not a word, just a low vibration like a hum that carried reassurance instead of language. He worked clumsily, his fingers stiff, but each motion careful, deliberate, never sharp. The iodine stung and the shepherd whimpered, paw jerking. The man held him not with strength but with presence, the weight of his body angled in calm against the storm of panic. It was a negotiation, every moment tested, every breath a question. And in that fragile exchange, something shifted. The shepherd's trembling eased. His eyes still darted, but they no longer sought escape. Instead, they returned to the man's face, reading it the way one reads weather in the clouds. The man's jaw was set, his brow furrowed, but there was no hardness in it. Only concentration, only patience. When the last strip of gauze was tied, crooked but secure, the shepherd exhaled a sound between sigh and growl, then lowered his head to the floor. The man leaned back, resting against the wall. He rolled up his sleeve, and in the lamplight his own arm bore a scar that curved from elbow to wrist. Jagged, pale, a history of fire or blade. For a moment, he stared at it as if surprised to still see it there. Then his eyes drifted back to the dog, whose chest rose and fell against the blanket. Broken things, side by side, no longer pretending not to be. Nights fell heavy that week. Snow deepened around the cabin, muting the world into stillness. The shepherd began to venture from the crate, first to the water bowl, then to the rug by the fire. He walked stiffly, the limp pronounced, but he walked. The man didn't coax him closer, he only made space. He left a glove on the floor, an invitation. He spoke little, but his silence grew less heavy, like a door left ajar instead of locked. Once, while splitting logs, he dropped the axe and winced, hand clutched to his ribs. The shepherd, startled by the sound, bolted to the doorway, hackles raised. But when he saw the man simply crouching, breathing hard, no threat in his frame, he crept back. Slowly, he lowered himself at the threshold, watching. The man's breath steadied, and when he looked up, the dog was still there, eyes fixed on him. For the first time, he gave a short nod of acknowledgement, as if saying, "I see you." The shepherd blinked and did not look away. Days turned into rhythms. The fire crackled, bandages were changed, bread was torn in halves instead of wholes. The man began to hum when he worked, tuneless but steady, and the dog's ears flicked toward it. Snow pressed against the windows. Coyotes called from the ridge, but inside the cabin, two lives beat against the cold together. One night, as the storm howled and the rafters groaned under ice, the shepherd rose from his place by the fire. Limping, cautious, he crossed the short distance to the chair where the man sat half asleep. He paused, watching, then lowered his head onto the man's boot. The weight was tentative, as though it could be withdrawn at any moment. The man stirred, looked down, and for the first time in years, perhaps decades, his lips curved into something near a smile. He didn't move his foot. He let the dog rest there, the silence around them no longer heavy but whole. Outside, the snow thickened, sealing the cabin into solitude. Inside, scar met scar, not as wounds but as bridges. And in that quiet, they began to heal, not perfectly, not completely, but together. The thaw came fast, too fast. One morning the cabin roof still sagged under snow, icicles hanging like dull knives from the eaves, and by evening the world was dripping. Water pattered against the porch boards, gushed from the gutters, carved shallow veins through the earth. The air smelled different, metallic, as if the land itself had split open. From the ridge, the river could be heard roaring before it was even seen, swollen with ice melt and greed. The man knew rivers. He had grown up near one, lost things to want, learned the way water could shift from friend to executioner without warning. That evening he stood at the window, mug in hand, watching the fog rise off the valley. The dog sat beside him, tail still, ears twitching at every distant crack of ice. Something in the air pressed low on both of them. Danger didn't need to speak. It made itself felt in bone and breath. When night fell, the storm began. Rain hammered the roof in sheets, and the wind carried a sound like 1,000 voices chanting one note. The cabin walls shivered with it. By midnight, the river had clawed out of its banks, and its growl carried all the way up to the cabin like a warning. The man pulled on his coat, boots heavy with mud, lantern in hand. He didn't have to call the shepherd. The dog rose immediately, limping but determined, falling into step beside him as though the rope from that first night had never been removed. They made their way down the slope, lantern light swaying in wild arcs across trees bent under the weight of rain. Mud sucked at their boots and paws. Branches snapped in the distance, carried downstream in the rushing black water. By the time they reached the river's edge, the world had turned into chaos. Water foamed over rocks, logs rolled in the current like bones, and the air hissed with mist. The man set the lantern on a boulder and leaned forward, squinting into the dark. The small bridge of planks and rope he had used for years to cross into the lower pasture was half submerged, one rope already snapped. The cattle would be trapped without the gate opened on the far side. He clenched his jaw. He couldn't let that happen. The shepherd barked once, sharp, ears pinned back. He paced the mud, eyes wide, then turned to the man as if to ask if he truly meant to go forward. The man placed a hand briefly on the dog's head. A weight, a reassurance, then stepped onto the first plank. It groaned under him. Water licked at his boots, icy, furious. He tested another step, then another, each one a negotiation with fate. Halfway across, the river roared louder, and the lantern's glow faltered in the distance. Rain poured in curtains, erasing the line between sky and water. The shepherd whined from the bank, pacing, claws sinking into mud. Then it happened, a surge, sudden and merciless. The plank beneath the man's boot gave way, cracking like a gunshot. His body pitched sideways, lantern light flaring across his face before darkness swallowed him. The current seized him with both hands. Water filled his mouth, hammered his ribs, dragged him down. He fought to breathe, to kick, but the river was stronger, older, ruthless. His hand clawed at a branch, slipped, clawed again, nails tearing. In the chaos his mind went strangely calm, so this was how it would end. Not by fire, not by years, but by water. But he was not alone. The shepherd, without hesitation, launched into the torrent. His injured leg faltered but did not fail. His body cut through the water with raw desperation, ears flattened, eyes wild. He reached the man, teeth closing not on flesh but on the collar of his coat. The weight dragged him under, but he thrashed upward, lungs burning, hauling with everything his scarred frame could give. The man's head broke the surface. A gasp, half water, half air, and the dog pulled, stroke after stroke, refusing to release. The river fought back. It spun them toward a whirl of branches, slammed them against a log. The man's shoulder screamed, his body half numb, but the dog's grip held. Lightning tore open the sky, turning night into blinding white for an instant. In that flash, man and dog were carved into silhouette, two figures locked in a fight against an endless beast. The bank was close, but the current kept dragging them sideways, away, always away. The man found a root jutting from the earth, fingers clawing, nails splitting. He latched on, teeth clenched, and with his free hand he caught the dog by the scruff. Together they fought against the pull, inch by inch, gasping, snarling, refusing. When they collapsed onto the bank, it was not graceful. They lay tangled in mud and weeds, coughing, shivering, lungs torn raw. The shepherd dragged himself up beside the man, chest heaving like a broken bellows. For a moment, neither moved. The rain beat down, and the river raged on, indifferent. But in that silence between thunder, something sacred lived, the knowledge that one life had saved another, and that debt bound them beyond choice. The man rolled onto his side, spitting water, his body bruised and trembling. He reached out with a shaking hand and laid it on the dog's back. His fingers curled into the wet fur, holding as though letting go meant surrendering everything. The shepherd, soaked and shivering, lowered his head against the man's chest, eyes closing, ears pressed flat by the storm. The river would rage all night. The rain would not stop until dawn. But on that bank in the dark, two scarred creatures had pulled each other from death. And nothing, not pain, not past, not the cold hand of the river itself, could take that away. Dawn arrived timidly, as if the night had frightened it. The rain had finally spent itself, leaving the valley shrouded in mist, the river swollen and snarling but no longer wild enough to claim. The air smelled of mud, pine, and the sharp tang of survival. On the bank, man and dog lay still, exhaustion binding them in silence deeper than sleep. The shepherd stirred first, shivering, his body a collection of aches wrapped in damp fur. He lifted his head, ears drooping, and nudged the man's shoulder with his muzzle. The man groaned, half in pain, half in gratitude, rolling onto his back. His face was pale beneath the beard, lips cracked, eyes rimmed red. But when he saw the dog hovering over him, eyes filled with something fragile and fierce. A sound escaped his throat, a laugh, hoarse and broken, but alive. He reached with a trembling hand and pressed it against the shepherd's soaked fur. The dog leaned into it, just enough. It was not affection born of comfort but of survival, two scarred creatures acknowledging the other had carried them through. They rose slowly, painfully. The man's ribs protested, his shoulder throbbed, but he wrapped an arm around the shepherd's neck for balance, and the dog steadied him. Together they stumbled back up the slope toward the cabin. Every step was a battle. Mud clung, roots caught, the limp in the dog's leg more pronounced with each stride. But they did not stop. They carried each other, step by step, until the cabin appeared through the thinning fog, its chimney still sending a faint line of smoke as though it had been waiting for them. Inside, the air was warmer, the fire still alive in embers. The man dropped heavily into his chair, boots leaving streaks of mud across the floorboards. The shepherd collapsed beside the hearth, paws sprawled, chest rising like a bellows. For a long time, neither moved. The only sound was the ticking of the clock and the crackle of wet wood as it caught fire. When at last the man leaned forward, his hand found the tin kettle. He poured water into 2 bowls, one metal, one ceramic, setting the metal one on the floor. The shepherd dragged himself upright and drank greedily, water splashing onto the wood. The man watched, his own cup shaking as he lifted it to his lips. His eyes softened, lines of pain and age folding into something gentler. And then, without ceremony, he spoke. His voice was low, gravelly, unused to company, but it carried weight, as if every word was chosen carefully. "Ash," he said. The shepherd lifted his head, droplets glistening on his muzzle. "That's your name now." "Ash. Because we both came through the fire, and we're still here." The dog blinked, ears tilting, as though listening not just to the word but to the intent wrapped inside it. He didn't move closer, didn't leap with joy. He only held the man's gaze for a long, unbroken moment, and in that quiet, something bound them more tightly than rope or deity recognition. Days after the flood were marked not by tasks completed but by survival shared. The man cleaned wounds, wrapped bandages, split wood one-handed while his shoulder healed. Ash followed, limping but constant, never straying far. When the man struggled to carry a log, Ash would brace against him, nudging his hip, steadying his balance. At night, when nightmares dragged the man awake, chest heaving, it was Ash who pressed against his legs, grounding him with warmth heavier than words. Winter passed slowly, each storm softer than the last, until the first shoots of grass bent through thawed earth. The river settled back into its bed, swollen but no longer angry. The land, scarred by water, began to green. And in that same rhythm man and dog healed. Ash's limp remained, but it became less of a wound and more of a mark, a reminder of the night he chose to fight the river. The man's shoulders stiffened in the cold, but it moved when it needed to, bearing weight again with stubborn dignity. Neighbors came now and then, riding up the track to check on damage. They asked after the flood, shook their heads at the river's ferocity, offered help in mending fences. But their eyes always strayed to the shepherd by the porch. "That the one from the auction?" Someone asked once. The man nodded. Thought he wouldn't make it. They said, half in disbelief, half in awe. The man only glanced at Ash, who met his eyes with steady calm. "Neither did I," he answered, voice plain, unembellished. But beneath it lived a depth only he and the dog understood. As spring settled, the cabin no longer felt like a place for one. Bread was sliced into 2 portions automatically. The chair by the fire always had Ash's fur on the rug beside it. The coat, once folded by the crate, now hung on its peg, replaced by the living presence of the one who had rested his head on it. Silence remained, but it had changed its shape, no longer heavy, but companionable, filled with the subtle music of breathing, of paws shifting in sleep, of a kettle sighing on the stove. One evening, the man and Ash stood together on the ridge. The sun dropped low, painting the river in copper light. Birds moved in scattered flocks across the horizon, their wings catching fire in the glow. The man rested his scarred hand on the dog's head, thumb brushing the divot between his ears. Ash leaned into it, steady, eyes fixed on the horizon as if he too could read what lay ahead. The man exhaled, slow and deep, and for once he allowed himself to believe in tomorrow. Not as a weight, not as something to endure, but as something worth waking to. And when he looked down at the dog, at Ash, who had once stood unwanted in the harsh glare of the auction lights, he saw not an animal he had saved, but a companion who had saved him in return. The wind moved through the trees, soft, unhurried. The land seemed to breathe again. And there on the ridge, under a sky brushed with the last fire of sunset, two silhouettes stood not as strangers, not as broken things, but as survivors who had finally found home, in scars, in silence, and in each other.